Hello, my name is Carolina, and along with my classmates Laura and Mariela, we are going to be teaching you what a historical lens is and how we are able to view it in literature. Before I dive into the lesson, I want to emphasize the importance of history. As we know, history is a study of the past, and although some view history as pointless, history helps us understand people and societies. History makes contributions on our own lives as well as to our own moral understanding, and helps us form our own identities. Now, what is a historical lens? A historical lens can be defined by reading a text for its contextual significance, which would include the following: information about the author, his or her historical moment, systems of meaning available at the time of writing, as well as what it says about that particular time and place. And how do we view it in literature? We are able to view a historical lens in literature by analyzing the time period and place that is being presented in the text, as well as how a writer's perspective may affect the way he or she writes about a particular time and place. Now we're going to be analyzing literature with a historical lens. The novel I decided to analyze was Breaking Through by Francisco Jimenez. The story was published in 2001, and it's about a story of a Mexican family that had immigrated to the United States in the late 1940s and the hardships they had experienced as a Mexican immigrant family here in the United States. In this story, I decided to analyze this quote, which I felt really truly gave a lot of historical context, and it states, "It all started back in the late 1940s when Papa, Mama, my older brother Roberto, and I left El Rancho Blanco, a small village nestled on barren, dry hills several miles north of Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, and headed to California, hoping to leave our life of poverty behind." Within that quote itself, I highlighted some specific pieces of text, which included late 1940s, Rancho Blanco, a small village, north of Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, headed to California, and life of poverty. By analyzing these specific pieces of text, I was able to find the time period, the setting, as well as some of the context about the characters themselves. And by doing so, I was able to kind of find a lot of historical background from the story, which made me understand the story even more. Like mentioned before, we were able to find the time period in which the story takes place, which was actually the 1940s. And by finding the time period of the story, we were able to know the social context, the awareness of technology, and patterns and trends that were occurring during that time period. In that quote itself, we were also able to find the setting of the story. We know that the family moved to California in order to find a better life. However, we also know that they originated from a small village in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. And by knowing that information, we're able to know the region as well as the culture that the characters come from, which helps us understand more of the historical context. By analyzing the time period and the setting, as well as the author's perspective, we are able to fully grasp the context of the story, and we can conclude that the family did come from poverty and is coming to America to seek a better life. However, this wouldn't have been possible if we didn't approach this using a historical lens.
Hi, my name's Laura, and today I'll be analyzing short stories with historical lenses. So, the first story I analyzed was A Horseman in the Sky by Ambrose Bierce, and it was published in 1889. It deals with a boy named Carter Druce who goes against his state, Virginia, to fight for the Union. And his job is to look out for any potential enemy soldiers that may arrive on his land. And Druce ends up discovering that his own father is a Confederate horseman spy, and he has to kill his own father. So in Horseman in the Sky, I picked two quotes that I felt that analyzed the historical context of the story. So the first quote that I picked was, "The duty of the soldier was plain. The man must be shot dead from ambush, without warning, without a moment's spiritual preparation, with never so much as an unspoken prayer. He must be sent to his account." So this quote to me shows that the duty of a soldier. So it tells us that we're in wartime, and what the soldier must do to protect him and his land. The second quote I picked was, "The country was wooded everywhere except at the bottom of the valley to be northward, where there was a small natural meadow through which flowed a stream scarcely visible from the valley's rim. This quote shows us where the setting took place. It tells us that the country was a wooded area and that there was a stream that flowed there. So from this we can see where the setting was and what the climate was and how it affected the soldiers. So this short story talks about the Civil War because Carter Druse is a Union State soldier. So in the Civil War, it started in 1861, and during this time, it was a lot of slavery going on. So it started because the northern and southern states were fighting over slavery. And Abraham Lincoln played a big role during the Civil War because he was the president during that time. And Lincoln wanted to keep the United States as one country, and he refused to recognize the southern states as an independent nation. So this caused a lot of controversy between the two states. And the Civil War is also known as the war with the most fatalities out of any war. It had 62,000 men killed, and although the U.S. had more factories and food and railroads, and the Confederates had strong defensive measures, like in more tactics to go off of, the North won the Civil War. Although they didn't have strong enough tactics, they still had the factories and food and railroads. So another short story I analyzed was an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. This was also by the same author, Ambrose Bierce, and this was published in 1890. And this has to do with Peyton Farquhar, a plantation owner, and he is being accused for interfering with the railroads, and this wasn't allowed, so that's why he's being executed. And he tries to put himself in a better place by thinking of his wife and his daughter.
In an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, I also decided to analyze two quotes that I felt showed historical contents. So the first one I picked says, being a slave owner and like other slave owners, a politician, he was naturally an original secessionist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. So I highlighted slave owner because that tells us that we are in slavery times, that people are being deprived of their rights, and the slave owners, or otherwise known as the master, they are telling us in that quote what their persona was like. The second quote says, some loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners, two private soldiers of the Federal Army directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. So from just reading civil life, that to me means we're in a time of war, because we're also talking about the Federal Army and sergeants, so that gives us more information that we can look at the Civil War to find out what else was happening during this time period. So for this short story, I'm focusing more on slavery during the Civil War because the short story talks more about slavery. So the slaves who ran away from their masters during the war found sanctuary in the Union borderlines. So a lot of the slaves would run away from their masters because they were deprived of a lot of things. They didn't get food, enough sleep, so that's why they would run away. But the Fugitive Slave Act stated that any escaped slaves had to be returned to their masters. So this is what returned them to their masters, because the masters needed them back to do chores, around the plantations. Harriet Tubman led a raid to free the slaves. She was very important during the Civil War time because she was the one who really helped the slaves get through those hard times. And during this time, the President Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he had to think about the repercussions abolishment would have on the country. So, of course, Lincoln wanted to help the slaves, but he couldn't because he knew that his his actions would have effects on everyone around the world. The war caused a shortage of food, which left slaves to face deprivation. So, like I said before, the slaves were very deprived of a lot of things, which is why they wanted to run away from their masters. And when the war was coming to an end, the Confederates contemplated allowing the slaves to help fight against the Union. So, a lot of the times they just wanted the white people to fight for them, but at the very end, they knew if they had the slaves' help that they could probably win. And after the war was over, the northern states added the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the 13th abolished slavery, so this helped a lot. The 14th gave rights to citizens, and the 15th allowed them to vote. So this really helped overall after the Civil War. This changed a lot of things for people who were enslaved.
Hi, I'm Mariela, and I will be analyzing poems with a historical lens. The time period and event I will be focusing on for my segment is World War II, or more specifically, the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the mass murder of 6 million Jews and other millions of persecuted people by Nazi Germany during World War II. Some of the other persecuted people include homosexuals, Romani people, the disabled, and many, many more. This was done by Nazi soldiers under the command of Adolf Hitler, the anti-Semitic Chancellor of Germany / leader of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with the idea that the German people were superior and considered the pure race, and therefore concluded with the belief all other races were inferior and had to be exterminated so the Germans could rise up. The poem I've selected for my segment is called First They Came for the Jews. But before I read it, here is some background information over this poem. It was published in the 1930s and it was written by Martin Niemöller, who is depicted on the right of the screen. This poem recalls the Nazi soldiers in World War II who took people from their homes to their concentration camps. I have underlined Nazi soldiers in the third bullet because although they're not directly mentioned in the poem, they are portrayed through the use and the repetition of the pronoun they. And some of these camps that people were taking to by Nazi soldiers were named Auschwitz, Terezin, Westerbork, and etc. This is the poem, and it reads, First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Now, I have highlighted two quotes which I will be focusing on in the next slide, because I want to discuss these pictures first. Based on what we know about the publication date and the title of the poem, we can infer that they is in fact referring to the Nazi soldiers, which are depicted at the top of the screen. As we can see from the bolded words, which are Jews, communists, trade unionists, and me, these soldiers would go for anyone that wasn't considered pure, anyone that wasn't German. And this implanted a fear in everyone over possibly being taken next to a concentration camp and eventually dying. Now, Onto the highlighted quotes. Quote 1 reads, "First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew." The Holocaust began in 1933 and it lasted until 1945. The Nazis targeted mostly Jews by taking them from their homes, streets, or hiding spots and sending them to the concentration camps. The second quote reads, "Then they came from me, and there was no one left to speak for me." The poem was written by Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor who used to support Hitler's policies but then turned away from them. Nazis would target anyone who spoke against Hitler's policies, even Germans. However, this quote also stands for the other millions of non-Jews lost due to the Holocaust. As Nazi Germany grew, they took literally anyone to the concentration camps. Moving on to the controversy. As previously stated, Niemöller supported Hitler and he believed Germany needed him as a leader. He had anti-Semitic views and incorporated them into his Christian teachings, but then later on discovered how the Nazis tried to take over the church. This angered Niemöller, and he began to attack the Third Reich in his teachings over their attempt to control the church. When the Nazis heard about this, they sent him to a concentration camp. This is where it becomes controversial. Because of his past beliefs, as in his hatred for Jews, it doesn't seem right for someone who once held hateful opinions over the largest targeted group in the Holocaust to speak for the pain, agony, and the deaths of millions of other people. And lastly, the purpose. The purpose of this poem was to inform on the numerous groups the Nazis targeted. However, there isn't one official version of this poem. There are numerous that state different groups that were taken by the Nazis. For example, there is one that instead of communists, it says first they came for the socialists. Although they have their differences, the meaning remains strong and there's so much value within the different versions. They show that this event haunted so many people and every side deserves to be heard. In conclusion, these three literary forms show that the historical lens can be captured anywhere. It's not limited in its creativity and it's definitely not beyond our scope. It teaches us cultures, social circumstances, and it provides contextualization from any time period.